But as I was saying, if you take literacy levels are extremely low to begin with. So that tells you instantly people who are not at school. And education would have been the preserve. Education would be too big a word, but going to school and learning would be the preserve and very exclusive preserve of only certain castes, groups, and then if you would have to be rich enough. And people who mattered, who were to matter, would then have to go outside the village. And that then placed it very much in the courtyard, in the rather large courtyard of the landlord class or the elite class, the children or the, what shall I say, the proteges of which would then be sent out. An example here interesting thing to follow up here is the life, for instance, of Ambedkar, your co-host in this conference, B.R. Ambedkar, who's written it copiously. He's one of the persons who also fashioned the Indian Constitution, as you know. He had his PhD from LSE, and also another one from Columbia, I believe. There's a kind of a thing about this. But he writes in a small little notebook, and there are 10 snippets there on growing up. And several of those snippets are to do with school. And it's interesting how he actually manages to get to school, what happens to him in school, the exclusions. For instance, he had to wait till the end of the day. There was one day in which the person who would give him water, he couldn't touch the water basin himself because he was a Dalit, an untouchable caste. And so, but that person happens to be on leave on that day. So he couldn't drink water that day and things like this. And also the question of, so I think, and he's an exception because he goes all the way right up to the top. So I think it reflects the power structures and the exclusion of Indian society. Very poor, traditional forms of education prevail, but then they also have limited access because they are catering to the reproduction of more traditional systems of power and hierarchy. But the notion of having, say, the Bible in a language you can understand and not in Latin, that sort of a thing is not there in the same thing. So you have this equivalence of the priest class, the priests, even in the villages, for every ritual, you have to go to the Sanskrit, and people are not really, so there is a similar system of control at the local level as well in education. I think the rise of the widening of the framework of education comes up with the widening of the middle classes and urbanization, large expansion of middle classes. And, well, since we are talking about that particular specific period, it happened through a framework of imperially led development as it was in India. It's inevitable that if you have roots in identity and your own background as a human being, as a social being, that you will use your education at some point or the other, no matter even if it's provided for managing the imperial project locally. Your imagination will run in different directions and you develop a critical eye and your education will become radicalized. I think that shows up very much in the Indian case. It takes it shows up amongst the elite. Nehru is supposed to be an epitome of socialistic thinking, although he was par excellence an elite person. Gandhi, highly educated, is of a different kind, as you would know, much more ecologically and rights-oriented, much more traditional in his perspectives, but very radical too. And there are so many others, and some very colonial too. There's recent scholarship on the rise of the economics profession in India, looking at the period from about 1920-ish thereon. And it's interesting that most of the economists all trained in Oxford or Cambridge or Edinburgh, and they come back and they have official jobs to do, which are part of the imperial structure of governing the country. But at the same time, they're making contributions which are quite radical in nature and challenging the system. So I think the oppositional imagination has a material base, an identity base. And no matter what the original purpose was, it is inevitable that it should also go in this direction. The when is from independence 1947 onwards, there's no question. I think that's common to virtually every post-colonial sort of situation. It's part of the national aspiration to look for all the things which you didn't have, which you thought were excluded. Education certainly was one. It was not necessarily a system of exclusion practiced, as I've said, exclusively by the colonial authorities in power. It was perhaps practiced at the base rather more sharply even than for the middle classes further up, because I think the British system was very much wanting to pick up the kids from the elite, or from the middle classes, and expand that, because that was the basis of their support as well. It was a kind of a group which was being evolved, but of course that group, as it gets educated and as colonialism proceeds, gets radicalized. 1947 onwards, it's a universal right in the Constitution, but really very sluggishly implemented. And the reason for that, I think, comes back to the question of tradition, modernity, continuity and change. And you have the colonials go away. And if you, some people would say, well, sort of, where's the difference? Because you get a new class in power, which has a socialistic idea of transforming the country. And they think education will happen. We will start building schools. And so all those aspirations are there. But there's no real sense of urgency. And there isn't a movement from below which is demanding it as of a right, we want it today. So it moves far too slowly. And that apathy and inertia reflects really the distance between the new elite, which is now looking at India's modernization project, and really the masses, who are largely outside of it. Let me share reflection, howsoever well-formed or ill-informed, about education in the Northwest. I think one of the persons who was very critical of, say, the very tardy rate of progress and the low quality of mass education in the US was Milton Friedman. And that's one of the points where I think he and, for instance, a person like Noam Chomsky might well have agreed, because he said this was a way of exclusion, it's a way of keeping the whole system as it is. He saw the modernization project working through education, and he thought that the masses were kept enslaved by ignorance, and the quality was appalling. And I think that's all those things are true. And also I think there's resonance there to Adam Smith, the notion of the division of labor, where people always say division of labor as a progressive, positive thing. As an economist, of course it is. It reduces the cost of production, economies of scale, and transformation, specializations, technical change, all that we know. That story of accumulation we know, and it's driven by that division of labor. But there is another side, which Adam Smith expands very well on. And he says it's a completely deadening process, because you are utterly de-skilled. The whole idea of a creative, if you think of the arts and crafts movement or something as a craftsman, where you are in touch, it's not alienated labor, although you will sell it to survive, but you see every aspect of it, from nature to the fashioning of it, to the tools, to the market, to the design and concept, the aesthetics. All those things are gone. All you have is a Fordist kind of I mean, it wasn't full Fordism at that point in time, it was batch production and all that. But still, Adam Smith is very sensitive to the deadening effects on the intellect and the mind of the division of labor. And it's interesting that if you see the early rise of an oppositional movement in education amongst the working classes, it comes, for instance, if you take Massachusetts and the what you call the Lovell factory girls, and you see their rights and their fight for being able to learn, and their own magazines which are set up. If you see the same thing also happening on the British side, I think it's remarkable. And you see the same textile girls also in Japan, incidentally, in the post-Meiji restoration period, where they are part of the export machine, you know. And there again, the radical movement comes from these girls wanting to learn. And I think these are searches for empowerment, which then subsequently, I would say that the progressive side of industrialists, the charitable philanthropists of that era, they set up schools, they set up radical projects. So you have workmen's colleges and various other programs in which right up to the 1950s, 60s, even now, they still prevail. So I think that's the notion of education, people trying to empower themselves. But really there is a separation, I think, between the elite management and control functions of a system and those education meant to skill you up to a point where you can become active and productive participants in that process without necessarily having the rights and your hands on the control levers. Well, India and knowledge economy, first of all, the question of serendipity or the linkage from history, this carryover post-independence of wanting to modernize education, and one of the aspirations there is scientific education, science as an instrument. And so, for instance, the Indian institutes of technology are set up, and the engineering institutes are set up in a big way. And it's a known story that it's the overproduction and the machine which is producing that in a regular way, which then provides the groundswell of engineers and scientifically trained manpower, which then is converted into the export sector, information technology. And that's why India could we had infinite supply, not of unskilled labor, but of skilled labor, which came into this. But there's also the question of body shopping, in the sense that you are actually doing very menial and specific, circumscribed jobs, so when America sleeps, these engineers wake up and they have to do all the stuff and they send it across. And I think you see the question of creative control, or even that knowledge-based production and that industry, it is relatively limited, even at the peak of this. So I think that's one point I'd like to make. The other point is that this project is not at all linked to any radical imagination. It's a purely productionist project in this way. The third side, which comes up, is that progressively, with the new era of globalization and the evolution of that earlier period of industrialization, which was not very labor absorptive, became, let's say, increasingly less labor absorptive. I would even argue that modern industrialization is dysfunctional with regard to labor absorption, because it cannot generate full employment on the basis purely of an industrial process. You could have very high rates of growth of industry or of the economy and have very low labor absorption. That's the case in India. So the old binaries of the elite and the workers and the working classes and the blue-collared workers and all this, I think that material basis has eroded. And if you were to ask, how is it that a worker is to claim their rights or to claim a good level of living, it's now not going to happen through trade unions so much as through exercising the rights as citizens. And because there is a very large amorphous part of the population which is in this amorphous sector called the informal economy. Bits of it are very productive, bits of it are really past sunset. They're really industries should be out. But they are not able fully to provide a basis for the long-term kind of development and aspirations which people have, can't be fulfilled there. So how do you go about that? Yeah, for example, you have the right to information, you have the right to food, you have the right to employment, and very powerfully the right to education coming in. And these are all rights which are meant then to empower you to work as a citizen, to claim rights further and to make something of your lives in productive terms. And that takes me to I think a point I raised yesterday in passing in the conference, which is the perspective of Wells, H.G. Wells, writing in 1900, 1902, somewhere there. But he was a futurist, wasn't he? Where he says that he says in all these developing economies, it's not going to be enough just to be literate. You have to be numerate, and you have to understand the language and the discourse of statistics, and those sorts of constructions which the state and others who oppose labor, who are not necessarily labor's protagonists, they use to control citizens. And so if you want to have a successful empowerment of people, they're going to have to know all these things to be able to argue and fight for their rights. And I think in that sense, the US is as backward in its education framework as India is at this point in time. US working classes, you could refer to as being in a collective state of what they call learned helplessness. And there have been lots of surveys where they ask them, what do you think would be a good notion of a society in terms of, say, being egalitarian? What should the bottom 40% have? What should the top? And the kind of numbers they come up with are really, and you say, what do you think is the reality? And the reality is that it's not in touch with how bad it is, how acutely unequal it is. They're not aware of that. And what they are wanting is something actually quite normal, which is less equal than what perhaps might even be available or what is available elsewhere in Europe. And there's a certain passivity. And it goes back to the partly Chomskyan, but partly Bowles and Gintis type of an idea that the function of mass education is not the same as the function which is in the elite Ivy League and the upper classes, where you're trying to, the upper level, it's really linked to the knowledge economy in a creative sense, where you are you're seeking the Nobel Prizes, or you're looking for the new patents, and you're looking for new technologies. It's a question of existential risk which you have to handle. You're working in those sorts of industries, completely, absolutely pioneering. And those are the big minds, and you're picking up these from there. And the rest is the system, which is to reproduce the day-to-day grind of an economy. And that's where I think Bowles and Gintis say that you have a functionality of education, the way it is structured, which is meant to prepare you for the labor market entry. It almost mirrors it and mimics it. So you enter in a nice way from school like that. But they also refer to the substantive aspects of education, that they are what Adam Smith said is a deadening process, and what Milton Friedman, from the other side of the spectrum, also says is leaving them completely disempowered. And so I think the US is also very backward in that regard. I think that those agendas need to be defined by the people who have been excluded by existing agendas. The trouble is, and this is now shades of nihilism or going backwards, but then you ask the question, if your imagination has been so lobotomized by existing systems and historically inherited systems of education, how do you suddenly demand from people a free imagination which is radical and is transformatory, emancipatory in nature, here and now, today? Tell me, what will you do? How should it be done? So I think it's a process of empowerment itself. And I think that process has to link up with other processes of challenge which are transformatory of their own lives and of society. And I think it's a very holistic challenge. And it's a tremendously uphill struggle, because we are so influenced by the media and by the press. And the media and the press are quite complicit in this whole process. And that being the case, where do you seek to legitimize, to validate alternative perspectives or sightings of something, a fleeting sighting of an alternative imagination? How do you say, yes, that's the way to go, and lots of people come around it? Now, so I don't know how that, maybe it comes to the oppositional projects to the mainstream project of unequal globalization. Is democracy the way it should be? And I think at points of crisis, perhaps new questions do get raised. And we know that in the US, those questions are getting raised in a big way. And of course, as soon as those questions get raised, there's a system which is trying to shut them down. But the challenge is to try and open them. So I think in universities, indeed, but I would also say outside of the universities, there needs to be a way where people can challenge those structures. But education itself is so unequally structured, isn't it? So, and people who get onto the other side, and they go through the window, go to the other side, then they want to shut the door, keep the others out, because it is exclusionary. The top 1% may not have come all from higher education, but if you look at the top 5% in relation to the rest in the US, that is the top elite in education. And they're not about to give it up by what they would call a watering down of standards, for instance. I think there are difficult questions here. In India, it's easier, perhaps, because I would say, I'll give you one example to close. There's been a lot of talk recently about gender oppression. And it's surfaced in a spectacular way with some horrendous cases of abuse, physical abuse, of rapes, which have come up into the press quite rightly, and which are causing tremendous anxiety, I think, as they should. Now, what really is the content of education? In India, we just keep talking all the time in human development indicators. How many people are enrolled in primary school? Have we got mass enrollments? But we never bother about the quality of education. We never bother about the substance of education. For instance, take the question of gender. Why not throw the ball to the question of how curricula are done? And how do we say, have you got a good education or not? Not purely in terms of marks, in terms of some meaningless agenda of curricula, but supposing we insert something like social frameworks. Gender would be one. So this is like Rawlsian stuff to some extent, although women are not the weakest of the weak in society, but really it's to do with a society section which is oppressed. A second one, for instance, would be being a good citizen and being an empowered citizen. How do you demand your rights? Shouldn't that be part of school? Now, I live in the Netherlands, and I'm sure in the US as well, and I'm sure in Australia as well. I'm sure there's a paper for kids going to school, how to get your driving license, how to drive your car well, and what are the rules for being on the road. There is one in the Netherlands. Now, that's the degree to which you're trying to create a citizen in an advanced, rich industrial or post-industrial country. You teach them how to actually be on the road. Well, can't we teach people here, or can't people demand to learn about how they can exercise their constitutional rights and go beyond that as well? Because somebody said one of the rights should be to redefine rights. So why can't they do that? And if you inserted those ideas into a schooling framework, well, to begin with, you need to change the teachers, but it is a generational project.